The wind screaming across the Dakota Badlands in January of 1886 did not merely blow, it hunted. It was a physical, predatory force, a relentless, howling wall of sub-zero agony that carried microscopic, crystalline shards of ice capable of slicing across exposed skin like finely milled glass. The temperature was plummeting rapidly toward a lethal 30 degrees below zero, the thin air tasting sharply of metallic ozone, frozen pine needles, and the profound, suffocating emptiness of a dead world. Clara's wrists were bleeding, the rough, freezing fibers of the heavy hemp rope biting deeply into her pale, shivering flesh as her husband violently jerked the knot tight against the petrified, splintered trunk of a deadwood pine. She was 26 years old, a woman whose hands possessed the rare, brilliant, and deeply nurturing instinct of a master herbalist and apothecary. She could coax a healing fever break from willow bark and draw the poison from a festering wound with packed clay and yarrow. Her soul was an overflowing well of maternal warmth, desperate to nurture, desperate to love. But her womb was empty. 5 years of dutiful, silent marriage. 5 years of weeping into a cold, coarse linen pillow while the women of the fanatical frontier settlement whispered behind their hands in the pews. In their deeply superstitious, rigid, and unforgiving society, a woman's entire human worth was measured strictly by her ability to bear children. When the winter wheat crop failed to root and the settlement's cattle began to die of the shivering sickness, the terrified, starving town needed a scapegoat. They looked at Clara's empty cradle, and they found their curse. Jebediah stepped back, the frozen, packed snow crunching loudly beneath his heavy leather boots. He was a gaunt, deeply fanatical man with cold, hollow eyes and a heart as unyielding as the permafrost. He looked at his wife, standing bound in the blizzard wearing nothing but a thin, faded cotton dress and a light woolen shawl that offered absolutely no protection against the catastrophic cold. "The Lord has spoken through the blight on my wheat," Jebediah spat, his voice devoid of a single ounce of human mercy, his breath pluming in thick, white clouds in the freezing air. "He has cursed my soil because I have harbored a barren, empty husk in my bed. You are a dead branch, Clara. A useless, empty vessel taking up the rations of the righteous." Clara's lips were already turning a terrifying shade of bruised violet, her entire body seized by violent, uncontrollable, bone-rattling shivers. "Jebediah, please," she wept, her voice a fragile, broken whisper instantly swallowed by the shrieking wind. The tears that spilled from her dark eyes physically froze against her pale cheeks before they could reach her chin. "I am your wife. I have tended your home. I have healed your fevers. Please do not leave me to the ice. You are a sacrifice to cleanse my ledger," he replied coldly, turning his back on her without a single trace of hesitation. He pulled himself up into the heavy leather saddle of his restless, shivering roan gelding. "May the frost take your empty body quickly. You are completely worthless to this earth. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue." Jebediah spurred the horse, galloping away into the blinding, swirling white out, leaving Clara entirely alone, bound to a dead tree in the center of an absolute, frozen hell. The agonizing, burning fire of the extreme cold slowly began to mutate into a terrifying, heavy, narcotic numbness. Clara's chin dropped to her chest. The crushing, suffocating reality of her husband's words settled heavier than the snow accumulating on her shoulders. Her deep, maternal heart, her vast knowledge of the earth, her quiet resilience, none of it mattered. She was barren. To the world, she was dead space. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the lethal, encroaching sleep of severe hypothermia, waiting for the freezing Dakota wind to finally extinguish her ruined life. The howling gale was suddenly, viscerally pierced by the rhythmic, heavy, terrifying huff-huff-huff of massive canine chests, followed by the sharp, slicing hiss of iron runners cutting through the packed ice. Clara's dark, frozen eyelashes fluttered weakly. Erupting from the blinding, churning white out like an ancient myth born directly from the frost was a heavy timber dog sled. Pulling the rig was a perfectly synchronized team of 8 massive, terrifyingly large, wolf-blooded sled dogs, their thick coats completely rimmed with white ice, their yellow eyes burning with feral, predatory focus. Standing on the rear runners of the sled, gripping the heavy leather reins, was Thaddeus Cole. Known in the terrified, whispered rumors of the territory simply as the Frost, Thaddeus was a reclusive, colossal fur trapper who resided in absolute, unbroken isolation on the lethal, frozen edge of the Badlands. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, his incredibly broad, heavily muscled frame wrapped entirely in thick, raw, weather-beaten grizzly bear pelts. A thick, dark, ice-crusted beard obscured the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the deep, brutal, jagged white frostbite scars that marked his cheekbones and jawline. Having lost his own wife and child to a horrific cholera outbreak years ago, a tragedy he blamed entirely on his own failure to reach a doctor in time, Thaddeus had banished himself to the brutal ice. He punished himself with the extreme cold, speaking to no one, valuing raw, silent survival and protective instinct over the fragile, hypocritical cruelty of civilized settlements. Thaddeus hauled back on the heavy leather reins with his thick, fur-mittened hands. "Whoa!" he rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly, tectonic vibration that seemed to command the very storm to pause. The massive wolf dogs instantly dropped to their bellies in the snow, obedient and silent. Thaddeus stepped off the iron runners. His pale, icy blue eyes, the exact color of glacial meltwater, locked onto the shivering, bound, half-dead woman tied to the deadwood post. He did not see a barren, useless husk. He saw a profound, sickening cruelty that instantly ignited a blinding, feral, protective inferno within his scarred chest. He closed the distance in 3 massive, heavy strides, the packed snow crunching under his thick muklux. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what sin had condemned her to the ice. He reached to his thick leather belt and drew a massive, razor-sharp hunting knife. With a single, effortless, brutal slash, Thaddeus severed the thick, freezing hemp ropes binding her wrists to the tree. As the tension vanished, Clara's frozen, entirely unresponsive legs completely gave out. She plummeted forward, plunging toward the hard ice. She never hit the ground. Thaddeus dropped the heavy knife and caught her, his colossal, heavy arms enveloping her fragile, shivering frame. He pulled her flush against his massive, bear pelt-clad chest. The sheer, overwhelming size of the man, the intoxicating scent of rendered tallow, dried sage, and cured fur, and the sudden, radiating barrier against the wind caused a tiny, desperate spark of life to flare in Clara's dimming mind. I'm empty," Clara whispered deliriously, her voice cracking, completely trapped in the trauma of her abandonment. He said, "I am a dead branch." "You are breathing," Thaddeus growled softly, the deep vibration of his chest rumbling against her freezing cheek. It was the only metric of worth the mountain man recognized. Without another word of explanation, Thaddeus violently stripped off the massive, incredibly heavy, body heat-soaked grizzly bear pelt he wore over his shoulders. He wrapped it entirely around Clara's shivering, freezing body, creating a dark, insulated, airtight cocoon that smelled intensely of his raw, masculine survival. He lifted her effortlessly into his massive arms, carrying her to the heavy timber sled. He settled her deeply into the cargo basket, burying her under 3 more layers of thick, cured wolf hides, completely shielding her from the biting wind. Thaddeus stepped back onto the rear runners, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He looked up at the sky. The ambient light was dying entirely. The sky above the Badlands was turning a bruised, terrifying shade of charcoal gray. The barometric pressure plummeted, and the wind began to shriek with a new, catastrophic intensity. It was the leading edge of a great white hurricane, a legendary, landscape-burying blizzard of absolute, zero-visibility lethality. "Mush!" Thaddeus roared into the gale, snapping the heavy leather reins. The massive wolf dogs surged forward as one, their heavy paws tearing into the packed snow. The iron runners hissed violently as the sled was launched directly into the blinding, churning, lethal heart of the whiteout, racing the freezing apocalypse toward the deepest, darkest isolation of the Badlands. Beneath the crushing, suffocating weight of the raw grizzly and wolf pelts, Clara existed in a state of violent, jarring sensory deprivation. The only reality was the rhythmic, bone-rattling thud crash of the heavy timber sled violently cresting unseen snowdrifts, and the deafening, apocalyptic shriek of the whiteout tearing across the Dakota plains just inches above her head. As the heavy, insulated, body heat-soaked furs trapped her own escaping warmth, the terrifying, narcotic numbness of severe hypothermia slowly began to break. The reversal was agonizing. As sluggish, half-frozen blood was forcefully pushed back into her extremities, it felt as though thousands of white-hot, microscopic needles were being driven directly into the beds of her fingernails and the soles of her feet. She curled into a tight, shivering ball in the dark, biting her pale lip until it bled, refusing to cry out over the howling wind. It felt like an eternity of violent motion before the sled suddenly lurched, the iron runners grinding heavily against packed earth and stone instead of ice. The howling of the blizzard was instantly muffled, transitioning from a deafening roar to a heavy, distant, vibrating drone. The heavy wolf pelts were peeled back. The sudden exposure to the freezing air made Clara gasp, but she was no longer in the blinding whiteout. They were inside a dark, cavernous tunnel, illuminated only by the faint, grey light filtering through a heavy wooden storm door Thaddeus had just pulled shut behind the sled. He had driven the dogs directly into a subterranean antechamber. Thaddeus did not wait for her to move her frozen limbs. His massive, fur-mittened hands reached into the basket, effortlessly hauling Clara's trembling body up into his broad chest. He carried her past the panting, ice-rimmed sled dogs and kicked open a second, incredibly thick, iron-banded door, stepping directly into the absolute heart of the fortress. It was a sod dugout, a heavy, bunker-like dwelling excavated directly into the side of a frozen, rocky hill. The walls were constructed of massive, unpeeled pine logs, heavily chinked with dry clay, while the low ceiling was supported by immense, load-bearing timbers that groaned under the crushing weight of the frozen earth and snow above them. It was a claustrophobic, lightless vault built entirely for raw survival against the deadliest winters on the continent. The stagnant air tasted thickly of rendered animal tallow, cured furs, and the sharp, piney scent of absolute, unbroken isolation. Thaddeus carried her to a low, heavy timber bench situated directly beside a massive, soot-blackened cast-iron stove that dominated the center of the dugout. He set her down gently, but immediately stepped back, creating a sudden, chilling physical distance between them. Moving with feral, silent efficiency, the giant struck a sulfur match against the cast iron. He touched the flame to a bed of dry pine needles and split birch logs inside the stove's belly. The fire caught instantly, a brilliant, roaring orange inferno that cast dancing, elongated shadows across the low, earthen ceiling and illuminated the brutal, deep, jagged frostbite scars tracking across his cheekbones and jaw. Thaddeus stood up to his full, towering height, forcing him to stoop slightly beneath the main timber beam. He did not look at Clara. His pale, icy blue eyes remained rigidly fixed on the cast-iron door of the stove. He pointed a thick, heavily calloused finger toward a stack of heavy woolen blankets on a nearby shelf, communicating a silent command for her to warm herself. Then, without a single word, the colossal mountain man turned his broad back on her. He walked deliberately back toward the heavy, iron-banded inner door, stepping out into the freezing, dark antechamber where the dogs were housed, pulling the door shut with a definitive, echoing click. Clara sat shivering before the roaring cast-iron stove, drawing her thin, faded cotton dress tightly around her bruised legs. The profound, suffocating silence of the dugout pressed down on her chest. To a woman whose entire adult life had been defined by the harsh, fanatical judgments of a cruel settlement, his extreme physical distance and absolute silence did not read as respectful chivalry. It read as absolute, undeniable revulsion. He knows, she thought, the hot, bitter tears finally spilling over her cracked cheeks. He looks at me and sees exactly what Jebediah saw. I am a barren, empty husk. He dragged a cursed, useless liability into his sanctuary, and now he cannot bear to look at the dead branch he saved. She wept silently for an hour, the agonizing, throbbing fire in her thawing fingers and toes entirely eclipsed by the crushing, suffocating ache of her own perceived worthlessness. But as the blistering heat of the cast-iron stove finally drove the deep, terrifying chill from her bones, Clara slowly raised her head. She wiped the tears from her soot-stained cheeks, her dark eyes scanning the Spartan, dimly lit dugout. Hanging from the low rafters were thick bundles of dried wild sage, yarrow, and braided sweetgrass. Resting on a heavy wooden table were massive, frozen sections of cracked elk bone, entirely rich with deep, yellow marrow. Through the thick wooden door of the antechamber, she could hear the low, pained whining of the massive sled dogs. They had run for miles over jagged, shifting ice, and she knew the brutal toll it took on their heavy paws. A fierce, desperate, white-hot spark of unyielding resilience suddenly ignited deep within Clara's chest. The fanatical town had condemned her, and the giant might regret her presence, but she was absolutely not a useless, dead branch. She was an apothecary. She possessed the rare, brilliant, undeniable power to heal, to nurture, and to sustain life with her own two hands. Clara forced herself to stand, her frozen joints screaming in protest. She walked to the heavy wooden table. Her fingers were a terrifying, mottled shade of bruised purple and crimson, the skin severely blistered and painfully stiff from the extreme frostbite. Every microscopic movement of her knuckles sent blinding flares of agony shooting up her forearms. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain entirely, completely refusing to be a burden. She hauled a massive, incredibly heavy cast-iron cauldron from the floor, struggling under the immense weight, and placed it directly onto the blistering top of the stove. She scooped packed, clean snow from a bucket near the door, melting it rapidly in the iron belly. She grabbed a heavy iron cleaver. Raising her raw, agonizingly painful hands, Clara began to violently, rhythmically hack at the frozen elk bones, exposing the rich, dense, calorie-heavy marrow inside. She threw the shattered bones directly into the boiling water. She moved to the hanging herbs, her fingers working with a mesmerizing, desperate, practiced grace. She crushed dried wild onions, heavy handfuls of sharp sage, and dark, cured salt meat, throwing them into the bubbling cauldron. The dugout was instantly filled with a thick, blinding cloud of incredible, intensely savory, life-saving steam. It was the smell of pure, unapologetic sustenance, a heavy, rich bone broth designed to rapidly rebuild the shattered strength of a starving body. But she was not finished. Clara took a smaller, heavy stone mortar and pestle. She ground dried yarrow root, pine pitch, and a heavy scoop of rendered bear tallow into a thick, potent, dark green medicinal paste. It was a brilliant, highly effective healing poultice, naturally antiseptic and incredibly soothing for cracked, bleeding canine pads. For 3 hours, Clara waged a relentless, silent war against the cold and her own agonizing pain. She did not stop stirring the heavy iron cauldron. She poured every ounce of her humiliation, every cruel whisper from the church pews, and the agonizing memory of her husband's rejection directly into the blistering heat of her work. "I am not empty," she chanted internally, her breath coming in ragged, heavy gasps as she forced her blistered hand to crush more yarrow. "I provide. I heal. I am not dead space." When the dark, rich broth was bubbling thickly, and the heavy stone bowl of green poultice was perfectly mixed, Clara walked to the heavy inner door leading to the antechamber. She pushed it open. The freezing air rushed in, but Clara knelt directly on the freezing dirt floor. One by one, she called the massive, terrifying wolf dogs to her. They were feral, dangerous beasts, but they sensed the profound, overflowing maternal warmth radiating from her soul. They whined softly, lifting their heavy, bleeding, ice-cracked paws into her raw, blistered hands. Clara meticulously, gently worked the dark green, soothing poultice deeply into the cracked leather of their pads, massaging the healing fat into their tired muscles, her soft voice murmuring gentle, praising comforts to the massive predators. Behind her, the heavy wooden storm door leading to the outside world creaked open. Thaddeus Cole stepped into the antechamber. He was entirely caked in fresh, driving snow, carrying a massive load of split firewood. He froze completely, his massive silhouette filling the doorway, his pale blue eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. The cold, dead, smelling air of his isolated bunker had been violently, miraculously eradicated. The claustrophobic dugout was impossibly warm, entirely saturated with the mouth-watering, intoxicating, wildly rich aroma of simmering bone marrow, dark sage, and wild onions. And kneeling on the freezing dirt floor of the antechamber, entirely ignoring her own horrific frostbite, was Clara. She was tending to his feral dogs, her pale face flushed with exertion, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. The massive beasts were entirely calm, licking her hands in absolute, devoted submission. She stood up slowly, her body trembling from the massive physical toll, the heavy stone bowl resting against her hip. She did not look like a frightened, broken victim of the blizzard. She met his shocked, feral gaze with a fierce, resplendent fire blazing in her dark eyes, an unspoken, silent roar of absolute, unbreakable defiance. Thaddeus stared at the perfectly treated, bleeding paws of his dogs, and then his pale eyes locked onto her blistered, purple, trembling fingers. He had survived the skeletal, starving nightmares of the ice alone, punishing himself for his inability to heal the ones he loved. But as he looked at the immense warmth she had created, the substantial, undeniable life and profound capability she had breathed into his dark, isolated tomb, the colossal, scarred mountain man realized with a sudden, violent clarity that he had not rescued a barren, empty husk from the deadwood post. He had brought home an absolute, radiant force of nature. That radiant force of nature anchored Thaddeus to the freezing dirt floor of the antechamber for a long, breathless eternity. He stared down at her bruised, blistered hands, hands that should have been paralyzed by the severe frostbite, yet were currently massaging healing tallow into the massive, lethal paws of a feral wolf dog. He did not step forward with a patronizing, gentle smile, nor did he offer a meaningless, soft platitude. He walked deliberately to her side, his heavy muklux silent against the packed earth. He knelt in the dirt, his massive frame entirely eclipsing the dim light filtering from the inner dugout. Without uttering a single sound, the giant reached out and gently took the heavy stone bowl from her trembling, exhausted grip. He set it on the ground. Then, his incredibly thick, calloused, frost-scarred hands reached for hers. He took her severely frostbitten, mottled purple fingers into his massive palms. He scooped a generous portion of the remaining bear tallow and yarrow paste, and with meticulous, agonizingly careful reverence, he began to work the healing salve directly into the cracked, weeping blisters of her own hands. Clara gasped softly, the medicinal sting of the yarrow biting into her raw flesh, but she did not pull away. The mountain man's touch was impossibly gentle, a stark, profound contrast to the brutal, merciless landscape he inhabited. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her raw hands with absolute, unfiltered worship, silently acknowledging the agonizing sacrifice she had made to care for his pack. When her hands were heavily coated in the shining, green poultice, Thaddeus stood, bringing her up with him. He led her back into the claustrophobic warmth of the main dugout, shutting the heavy inner door against the dogs and the cold. They sat together in the flickering orange light of the cast-iron stove, eating the thick, rich, life-saving elk bone marrow broth in profound, heavy silence. It was a communion of two deeply scarred survivors, sharing the unapologetic, caloric sustenance required to fight the ice. But the Dakota Badlands are not easily conquered, and the Great White Hurricane had not yet reached its catastrophic apex. By midnight, the barometric pressure within the subterranean bunker dropped so violently that Clara's ears physically popped. The shrieking of the blizzard outside escalated from a howl into a deafening, apocalyptic, continuous roar that vibrated the massive, load-bearing timbers holding up the earthen ceiling. The ambient temperature outside plummeted past 40 degrees below zero, an incomprehensible, alien cold that possessed the kinetic power to shatter solid steel. Inside the dugout, the massive cast-iron stove was roaring, burning violently as the intense draft from the chimney pulled the flames higher. But the ancient metal was being subjected to extreme, terminal thermal shock. The belly of the iron was blistering hot, while the heavy exhaust pipe connecting to the frozen earth above was being relentlessly battered by the sub-zero apocalypse. The failure was sudden, violent, and absolute. Crack bang. The sound was as deafening as a heavy-caliber rifle firing within the claustrophobic vault. A massive, jagged fissure violently ripped straight down the center of the cast-iron stove. The sheer kinetic force of the fracturing metal physically blew the heavy iron door completely off its hinges, launching it onto the dirt floor. A thick, blinding, choking cloud of black soot and pulverized ash violently erupted into the room, instantly smothering the flames. The fire died within seconds. And with the fire gone, the lethal, predatory cold of the Badlands did not just seep back into the dugout. It violently slammed into the room like a physical, crushing tidal wave. Clara coughed violently, her lungs burning from the acrid soot, but the cough was instantly cut short by a brutal, involuntary gasp as the freezing air hit her skin. She had already been severely compromised by the hours spent bound to the deadwood post. Her core temperature had never fully stabilized, relying entirely on the radiant heat of the stove. Without it, her body instantly, catastrophically failed. Violent, bone-rattling rigors seized her entire frame. She collapsed onto the heavy timber bench, her teeth clattering together so hard she tasted copper. The terrifying, narcotic numbness she had felt out in the snow immediately rushed back into her veins, a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice dragging her consciousness straight back down into the dark. "Thaddeus," she whimpered, her voice a fragile, broken thread instantly swallowed by the darkness of the freezing dugout. The giant did not panic. In the pitch-black, freezing void of the ruined bunker, Thaddeus Cole operated on pure, feral, unadulterated survival instinct. He knew that attempting to rebuild a fire in a cracked, completely compromised stove would only fill the unventilated dugout with lethal carbon monoxide, suffocating them both before the cold could finish the job. There was only one biological furnace capable of generating enough radiant heat to thaw her freezing core. He moved toward her in the dark, his massive hands finding her violently shivering shoulders. He lifted her effortlessly from the bench and carried her to the heavy, low timber bed frame in the deepest, most insulated corner of the earthen bunker. "You're freezing," Thaddeus rumbled, his deep voice vibrating through the pitch-black air. "Your core is shutting down. We have to share the heat. Strip the wet layers." Clara's fingers were completely unresponsive, locked into rigid, frozen claws. She couldn't even grasp the fabric of her thin cotton dress. Sensing her paralysis, Thaddeus took over. His massive, calloused hands moved with frantic, pragmatic urgency. He violently tore away the thin, damp cotton dress and the useless woolen shawl, leaving her in nothing but her thin, white thermal undergarments. He then stood beside the bed and rapidly stripped away his own heavy, raw grizzly pelts, his canvas duster, and his thick flannel overshirt, stripping himself down to his heavy woolen base layers. He crawled directly into the bed beside the seizing, freezing woman. Thaddeus dragged 3 massive, incredibly thick, heavy timber wolf pelts and a dense buffalo hide completely over them, creating a dark, heavily insulated, airtight cocoon against the plunging temperature of the room. He reached out in the dark and forcefully pulled Clara's fragile, violently shaking body completely flush against his incredibly broad, heavily muscled, fiercely hot chest. He wrapped his massive, powerful legs securely over her freezing thighs, and draped his thick, heavily scarred arms entirely across her shivering back. He pressed her face directly into the crook of his thick neck, utilizing every single ounce of his massive, living physical bulk as a literal, vital, biological furnace, forcefully driving his deep, robust body heat directly into her dying core. For the first 2 hours, the violent, bone-rattling tremors of her hypothermic shock threatened to shake them both apart beneath the heavy furs. Clara was trapped in a delirious, terrifying twilight, her fevered mind violently pulled back into the absolute darkest, most humiliating nightmare of her existence. She wasn't just freezing, she was drowning in the echoes of her fanatical husband's cruelty. "I'm sorry," Clara wept, her voice a broken, raspy, agonizing whisper vibrating against his collarbone, her tears soaking into the warm fabric of his thermal shirt. She was hallucinating, trapped back in the judgmental, whispering pews of the settlement church. I tried. I prayed. But it's empty. I am just a barren husk. I am a blight on the harvest. Thaddeus's massive chest hitched, his heart completely shattering in the dark. The terrifying, feral mountain man felt a profound, agonizing wave of absolute fury toward the men who had convinced this magnificent, life-giving creature that she was worthless. I'm a dead branch, Clara sobbed, her freezing hands frantically clutching at his broad shoulders, her fingers desperately searching for purchase in the dark. I have no worth. You should have left me on the wood. You are wasting your warmth on a woman who cannot give life. Stop, Thaddeus commanded, his voice a deep, resonant, tectonic rumble that vibrated the very marrow of her bones. He shifted his weight, pulling her even tighter against his massive frame, completely enveloping her in his boundless, fiercely protective warmth. He lifted his massive, calloused hand, his thick, rough fingers gently finding her face in the pitch-black cocoon. He meticulously wiped the freezing tears from her cheeks, his thumb resting gently against her jaw. They are blind, pathetic cowards, Thaddeus whispered fiercely, his breath warm against her forehead. They look at a woman and see nothing but livestock. They measure a soul by what it can breed, because they possess absolutely no understanding of what it means to actually nurture. He pressed his bearded, frost-scarred cheek directly against the top of her head, his massive chest rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm. 10 years ago, the giant breathed, his voice thick with an ancient, unspeakable grief. I had a wife. I had a son. The cholera swept through the post. I watched them burn from the inside out. I prayed to the same God your husband preaches to, and my prayers were met with graves. A womb does not guarantee life, Clara. A womb does not stop the ice. A womb does not stop the sickness. He shifted his rough hand downward, gently, reverently resting his massive palm flat against her stomach, the very epicenter of her shame, the place the world had deemed a cursed wasteland. He did not touch her with pity. He touched her with absolute, unwavering worship. This does not define you, Thaddeus rumbled, his voice cracking with raw, undeniable emotion. You took my bleeding, feral dogs into your frozen hands and you healed them. You took cracked bones and boiled them into a feast. You possess a spirit that radiates a warmth strong enough to melt the glaciers in this badland. You are not a dead branch, Clara. You are the deepest, strongest, most magnificent root I have ever seen. You are absolute, undeniable life. The profound, explosive weight of his words completely shattered the decades of conditioned, suffocating shame that had imprisoned her soul. Clara unleashed a raw, guttural, jagged sob, burying her face deeply into his thick chest, her tears flowing freely not from the pain of the cold, but from the overwhelming, agonizing relief of a woman finally, truly seen and validated. She clung to his massive frame, her body slowly, miraculously absorbing the radiating, life-saving heat of the scarred mountain man, anchoring her fleeing spirit permanently to his unyielding warmth. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The long, suffocating hours of the pitch-black night slowly bled away beneath the heavy, insulating weight of the timber wolf pelts. Clara did not freeze. Anchored completely to the massive, radiating biological furnace of the mountain man's chest, the terrifying ice in her veins was methodically, relentlessly pushed back. She drifted in and out of a deep, healing sleep, lulled by the steady, powerful, rhythmic thud of Thaddeus's massive heart beating directly against her cheek. Outside the earthen bunker, the catastrophic, apocalyptic shrieking of the great white hurricane gradually began to lose its lethal momentum. By mid-morning, the wind died entirely, leaving behind a profound, heavy, absolute dead silence that pressed down on the frozen Dakota Badlands like a suffocating burial shroud. Thaddeus shifted in the dark, his thick, calloused hand gently pulling the heavy edge of the buffalo hide down just an inch to test the air. The ambient temperature inside the ruined dugout was still brutally cold, smelling sharply of the pulverized soot from the cracked cast-iron stove, but the deadly, plunging drop had stabilized. Suddenly, the massive, scarred chest beneath Clara went completely rigid. Thaddeus did not hear a shout. He felt the subtle, unnatural vibration transferring through the frozen earth above them, followed immediately by a low, guttural, terrifyingly aggressive snarl erupting from the antechamber. The massive wolf dogs were not whining for food. Their heavy hackles were raised, the deep chests vibrating with a primal, lethal warning. "Stay exactly where you are," Thaddeus whispered, his voice dropping into a terrifying, gravelly register that vibrated the very floorboards. He carefully, swiftly slipped out from beneath the heavy pelts, instantly wrapping his massive, heavily muscled frame in his thick canvas trousers and heavy wool overshirt, entirely ignoring the freezing air biting at his skin. Down in the blinding, snow-blind expanse of the Badlands, Jebediah had not let his sacrifice go unmonitored. When the blizzard broke, the fanatical, controlling husband had ridden out with two heavily armed, deeply zealous settlement enforcers to ensure the Barren husk had frozen to death, securing his twisted narrative for the town. Instead, he found the deadwood post empty, the thick hemp ropes slashed by a massive blade, and the faint, deep impressions of heavy iron sled runners barely visible beneath the fresh snowdrifts, leading directly toward the forbidden, isolated ridges. Driven by a manic, toxic rage that his absolute authority had been challenged, Jebediah had tracked the giant to his subterranean tomb. Thaddeus moved through the dark dugout with the terrifying, fluid, completely silent speed of an apex predator. He did not reach for a repeating rifle. In the tight, claustrophobic, low-ceilinged confines of the earthen bunker, a long barrel was a fatal liability. He reached into the shadows near the ruined stove and hoisted a massive, rusted, 5-foot iron whaling harpoon, a brutal, heavy implement of pure slaughter he used for deep ice fishing. In his left hand, he drew his massive, razor-sharp hunting knife. He flattened his colossal frame against the heavy log wall right beside the inner door, his pale, icy blue eyes dilated into the cold, lethal stare of the Wolverine. In the antechamber, the heavy outer storm door was violently kicked open, letting in a blinding shaft of brilliant, white sunlight reflecting off the fresh snow. The dogs snarled viciously, but a heavy rifle butt cracked against a skull, accompanied by a cruel, shouting command, forcing the pack backward. The heavy, iron-banded inner door of the dugout was violently breached, the wood splintering inward. A blinding wave of freezing, sub-zero air and harsh white light rushed into the pitch-black room. Two settlement enforcers stepped through the threshold, their heavy boots crunching on the dirt floor, their rusted Winchester rifles raised, their eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden, suffocating darkness of the bunker. They did not see the Leviathan waiting in the shadows. Thaddeus erupted from the darkness like a localized avalanche of pure, unadulterated violence. He swung the massive, heavy iron whaling harpoon in a devastating, horizontal, upward arc. The brutal, rusted iron tip effortlessly bypassed the first enforcer's rifle, driving directly upward into the man's heavy wool coat, shattering his ribs with a sickening, wet crunch. The sheer kinetic force of the giant's thrust physically lifted the man off his boots, violently pinning his thrashing body back against the heavy timber doorframe. The second enforcer panicked, violently jerking the lever of his Winchester and firing blindly into the dark. Boom! The deafening, percussive blast of the rifle completely shattered the silence of the dugout, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding the room. The heavy lead bullet tore a jagged chunk of wood from the low ceiling, showering dirt over the bed. Before the enforcer could cycle the lever again, Thaddeus dropped the harpoon and closed the distance in a single, terrifying stride. He lunged forward, his massive, heavily calloused left hand wrapping entirely around the enforcer's throat, violently cutting off his scream. Thaddeus drove the man backward with the force of a runaway locomotive, slamming his skull brutally against the unyielding, frozen earth wall of the dugout. The enforcer's eyes rolled back, his body going completely limp as he crumpled into the dirt. But the sheer, chaotic, deafening violence of the melee in the tight entryway provided a fatal, cowardly distraction. Jebediah had not entered first. The gaunt, fanatical husband had waited for his men to clear the threshold. He slipped past the brutal hand-to-hand combat, stepping deep into the freezing, soot-filled dugout. His cold, hollow eyes immediately locked onto the heavy timber bed in the corner. He raised his heavy Sharps rifle, pulling the hammer back with a sharp, metallic clack. Clara had not stayed hidden beneath the pelts. The deafening gunshot had ripped her from the bed. She stood near the shattered, soot-covered remains of the cast-iron stove. She was wearing only her thin, white thermal undergarments, her pale skin exposed to the freezing air, her dark hair wild and tangled. "Look at this abomination," Jebediah hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic, malicious arrogance, entirely ignoring the slaughter occurring 10 feet behind him. He leveled the heavy barrel of the rifle directly at Clara's chest. "I left you to the righteous frost, and you crawl into the filthy bed of a savage beast. You survived the ice, Clara, but you are still a cursed, empty, barren husk. The Lord demands your cleansing, and I will not return to the settlement until the dead branch is completely severed." He expected her to weep. He expected the fragile, utterly broken, humiliated woman who had begged for her life on the deadwood post to collapse onto her trembling knees, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating shame he had relentlessly driven into her soul for 5 long years. Clara did not weep. She did not shrink her shoulders. She did not attempt to hide her body or beg for his twisted mercy. The suffocating, decades-long terror of being a shamed, barren victim vanished entirely. It was completely, irrevocably incinerated by a blinding, white-hot inferno of absolute, protective fury. She was not a dead branch. She was not empty. She was the profound, radiating force of life that had healed the feral hounds and anchored a colossal, scarred mountain man back to his own humanity. She was absolute, undeniable iron. Clara's dark eyes darted slightly to the ruined cast-iron stove at her feet. Resting in the pulverized black soot was a massive, incredibly heavy, 3-foot solid iron fire poker. "I am not your sacrifice!" Clara roared, a primal, feral, deafening battle cry that shook the very earth of the dugout ceiling. She dropped into a deep, incredibly wide stance, completely ignoring the agonizing, burning pain in her frostbitten toes. She reached down with her raw, blistered hands and grabbed the heavy iron shaft of the poker. She did not attempt to lift the massive weight with just her fragile wrists. She channeled every single ounce of her accumulated humiliation, her boundless, fierce devotion to the man defending their home, and the raw, unadulterated strength forged by years of grinding herbs and surviving the harsh frontier. Jebediah's hollow eyes widened in sheer, uncomprehending shock. "Drop it, you Barren!" Clara drove her thighs and her shoulders forcefully upward, pivoting her entire torso in a violent, devastating, horizontal arc. She swung the massive, heavy iron fire poker like a wrecking ball of pure, righteous vengeance. Crack. The impact was catastrophic. Clara slammed the solid, heavy iron shaft directly into the left side of Jebediah's collarbone and shoulder. The sickening, deafening sound of his clavicle and scapula completely shattering under the sheer, crushing kinetic weight of her heavy swing echoed violently through the freezing air. Jebediah unleashed a high, piercing, mind-shattering shriek of absolute, paralyzing agony. The massive rifle flew uselessly from his hands, discharging into the dirt floor as the sheer, devastating force of Clara's blow physically lifted the gaunt, fanatical tyrant entirely off his boots. He was launched violently backward, flying through the breached doorway and crashing heavily into the freezing, hard-packed snow of the antechamber. He wreathed in the white powder, clutching his completely ruined, shattered shoulder, gasping and screaming for breath, his fanatical authority completely obliterated by a single, devastating strike from the very woman he had deemed too weak to live. Clara dropped the heavy iron poker. It hit the dirt floor with a heavy, resonating thud. Her chest was heaving with deep, ragged gasps, her arms trembling violently from the massive adrenaline spike, her pale face flushed a dark, vibrant crimson with absolute exertion. She stood tall in the center of the freezing, soot-stained dugout, the cold air biting at her thin thermal garments, entirely unashamed, completely unapologetic. She had defended her sanctuary, completely obliterating the cruel tyrant who had traded her life for his own vanity. At the front door, the chaotic sounds of the brutal melee completely ceased. Thaddeus Cole stepped over the groaning, unconscious bodies of the enforcers. He was breathing heavily, his massive chest heaving, his hands stained with crimson blood. His pale, icy blue eyes were wild and dilated with feral panic, fully expecting to find his sanctuary bleeding out on the floor. He looked at the discarded, smoking rifle. He looked at the heavy iron poker resting in the soot, and the screaming, broken husband writhing in the snow outside the door. And then, the colossal, frost-scarred sovereign of the Badlands looked directly at Clara. She stood triumphantly in the center of the dugout, her dark hair wild and untamed. She met his shocked, feral gaze with a fierce, resplendent fire blazing in her dark eyes, an unspoken, silent roar of absolute, unbreakable defiance. Thaddeus didn't utter a single word. He entirely ignored the freezing air and the blood on his hands as he rushed across the dirt floor, pulling his fierce, powerful, absolute equal directly into his massive, heavily muscled chest. The crushing, unyielding vice of his massive, blood-slicked arms enveloping her thin, thermal-clad frame was not a gentle, polite embrace. It was a desperate, ferocious anchoring of two souls who had stared directly into the lethal abyss and refused to blink. Clara buried her face directly into the coarse, heavy wool of his overshirt, inhaling the sharp, acidic stench of burnt black powder, the metallic, hot tang of fresh blood, and the deep, grounding, masculine aroma of cured leather and sweat. Thaddeus's colossal frame trembled against her, his massive chest heaving with ragged, silent gasps as he buried his heavily bearded face into her dark, wildly tangled hair. The terrifying, feral leviathan of the Badlands was holding onto her as if she were the only solid, warm object remaining in a fractured, freezing universe. Slowly, the deafening adrenaline that had saturated the claustrophobic dugout began to drain away, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence broken only by the howling wind outside and the pathetic, high-pitched whimpers of Jebediah groveling in the snow. Thaddeus reluctantly pulled back from her warmth. His pale, icy blue eyes frantically scanned her flushed face, his thick, frost-scarred fingers gently touching her cheeks, checking for any sign of a stray bullet graze or a bruise. Finding her completely unharmed, the feral panic in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a cold, unyielding, terrifying resolve as he turned his massive head toward the shattered doorway. The freezing, sub-zero air was pouring into the room, swirling with the black soot of the ruined stove. Jebediah was clutching his completely shattered collarbone, his face the color of spoiled milk, hyperventilating in a pool of his own freezing blood just beyond the threshold. Thaddeus did not reach for his knife. He walked deliberately to the doorway. He reached down and gripped the heavy collars of the two unconscious enforcers, dragging their dead weight effortlessly out into the freezing snow, tossing them beside the whimpering husband. Thaddeus towered over the broken fanatic. He did not need to shout. His deep, tectonic voice cut through the howling wind with absolute, undeniable finality. "Crawl back to your righteous ledger," the giant rumbled, his breath pluming in a massive white cloud. "Let the frost judge your harvest now. If your shadow ever touches my ice again, I will not leave you breathing." Thaddeus stepped back, grabbed the splintered remnants of the heavy inner door, and violently forced it shut, wedging a heavy timber beam against the frame to seal out the lethal cold and the pathetic men who had brought it. He turned back to the room, leaning heavily against the logs, and let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. Clara's dark eyes instantly darted to his left arm. The thick sleeve of his wool overshirt was completely soaked in dark, spreading crimson. During the chaotic, brutal melee in the dark, the sharp, rusted iron sight of the enforcer's Winchester had deeply, violently gashed the giant's forearm. The wound was bleeding heavily, the hot blood dripping steadily onto the dirt floor. Clara did not hesitate. The freezing air in the room was biting, but her apothecary instincts completely overrode her shivering. She rushed to her heavy canvas bag of supplies she had salvaged from the sled. She could not boil water on the ruined cast-iron stove, so she grabbed a heavy glass bottle of high-proof distilled grain alcohol and a clean linen bandage. She guided the exhausted, bleeding giant to the heavy timber bed, forcing him to sit. "Give me your arm," she commanded, her voice steady and absolute. Thaddeus extended his massive, corded forearm. Clara poured the harsh, stinging alcohol directly into the deep, jagged laceration. The giant's massive jaw clenched, the thick muscles in his neck bulging, but he did not make a single sound. Clara threaded a curved iron suture needle with heavy, boiled silk thread. Her own fingers were still severely blistered and mottled purple from the frostbite, her joints aching with a dull, throbbing fire, but her hands moved with meticulous, maternal, unhurried perfection. She pushed the needle through his tough, scarred skin, pulling the deep wound cleanly and tightly closed. The intimacy of the act, the scarred, feral beast sitting in absolute, silent submission while the woman deemed a useless husk, flawlessly repaired his torn flesh, was a profound, heavy sacrament in the dark room. When the wound was tightly bound in clean linen, a profound, heavy melancholy suddenly settled over Thaddeus's pale eyes. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the agonizing, crushing weight of his own perceived monstrousness. He looked around the ruined, freezing dugout, at the shattered stove, the bullet holes in the timber, the blood pooling in the dirt, and the sheer, chaotic violence he had dragged this brilliant, nurturing woman into. He stood up abruptly, creating a sudden, chilling physical distance between them in the freezing air. Thaddeus walked to the deepest, darkest recess of the dugout, where a heavy, flat stone concealed a hollow cavity in the frozen earth. He shoved the stone aside. With a heavy grunt, he hauled a massive, bulging leather sack from the dirt. He carried it to the heavy wooden table and dropped it. The rawhide tie came undone, revealing a staggering fortune of heavy, minted gold eagles and raw gold nuggets, the accumulated wealth of a decade spent trapping the most dangerous, isolated reaches of the territory. "The sled dogs are uninjured," Thaddeus rasped. His voice was entirely hollow, stripped of all the vibrating, tectonic warmth he had shared with her in the dark the night before. He refused to look at her face, staring rigidly at the gold. "The blizzard has broken. With the team, I can get you to the major railhead in Cheyenne in 3 days. You will pack this gold. You will purchase a first-class ticket to San Francisco or back east." Clara's heart seized, a cold, jagged spike of dread piercing her chest. "Thaddeus, what are you saying?" "I am saying you hold the means to a completely different existence," the giant growled, the words tearing out of his throat like swallowed glass. He gripped the edge of the heavy timber table until his thick knuckles turned bone white. "With this wealth, you can buy a sprawling, warm home. You can open a grand apothecary in a civilized city. You will be respected. You will be safe from the ice, and safe from the religious zealots." He finally looked up, his pale, icy blue eyes completely shattered, filled with a self-loathing so immense it threatened to swallow the dugout entirely. "Look at the blood on my hands, Clara. Look at the violence I brought to your feet. I am a scarred, feral beast who lives in a frozen dirt hole and speaks through butchery. You are a woman whose entire soul is designed to nurture and give life. I cannot protect you from the brutality of the world when my entire existence is built upon it. Go to the city. Live in the warmth. Live in the light." He turned his broad back to her, his massive shoulders trembling violently as he fought a losing battle against the agonizing, suffocating grief of his own sacrifice. He truly believed he was unfit to breathe the same air as the magnificent, warm woman who had healed his dogs and thawed his frozen heart. Clara stared at the heavy sack of gold. It was the ultimate key to absolute societal power. It was the financial means to erase her past, to completely escape the harsh, freezing reality of the Badlands, and to finally be deemed acceptable by a civilized world. Clara walked slowly toward the heavy timber table. Thaddeus squeezed his eyes tightly shut, listening to her bare feet moving across the dirt. He waited for the rustle of the coins, bracing his scarred soul for the excruciating, final sound of her packing the wealth, preparing to leave him to rot in the silent ice forever. Clara did not pack the gold. She reached out with her blistered, bruised hands and violently swept her arm across the table. The massive leather sack plummeted to the earth, the heavy gold coins scattering uselessly into the dark, freezing dirt, entirely ignored and permanently rejected. Thaddeus spun around at the sound of the crash. His jaw dropped, his pale eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. "What have you done? That was your entire safe future." Clara turned to face him, the faint, grey morning light illuminating her pale, resilient silhouette in her thermal garments. She did not look like a frightened, discarded wife. She looked like the absolute, unquestionable sovereign of the Badlands. "Safe from what?" Clara demanded, her voice ringing out with a fierce, crystalline authority that commanded the very frost to melt. She closed the distance between them with steady, majestic strides. "Safe in a civilized world? The same world that tied me to a deadwood post and left me to freeze because my womb was empty. The world that measures my human soul by my utility to their vanity." She marched right up to his towering frame, refusing to let him look away, her dark eyes blazing with an overwhelming, consuming inferno of absolute devotion. "I was told my entire life that I was a dead branch," Clara stated, her voice trembling with raw, tectonic emotion. She reached out, her bruised hands gripping the heavy fabric of his wool overshirt, pulling the giant forcefully downward until his face was inches from hers. "But you pulled me from the ice, wrapped me in your own body heat, and told me I was the strongest root you had ever seen. You shared your absolute life force with me when the world threw me away." She pressed her palms gently against his heavily bearded, frost-scarred cheeks, her thumbs tracing the deep, jagged white lines of his trauma. "A mother's heart is not defined by biology, Thaddeus Cole. It is defined by the absolute, unyielding will to protect, to heal, and to sustain the life placed in her hands," Clara whispered fiercely, hot tears streaming down her face. "My roots are permanently planted in this frozen earth. I am not going to Cheyenne. I am never, ever leaving this ice. You are my home." The impenetrable, stoic iron walls of the mountain man instantly, completely disintegrated into dust. A raw, guttural, jagged sob tore itself from the very depths of his massive chest. He collapsed to his knees on the freezing dirt floor, completely ignoring the pain in his stitched arm. His enormous arms wrapped desperately around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his weeping, scarred face directly into the soft curve of her stomach, clinging to her resilient frame as if she were the only absolute truth in a dissolving universe. "My root," Thaddeus wept, the hot tears soaking into the thin fabric of her thermal shirt, his broad shoulders shaking with the profound, agonizing relief of a man finally, truly brought into the light. "My absolute, perfect life. My wife. I am right here," Clara whispered, her calloused fingers weaving gently through his thick, dark hair, cradling his heavy head against her body with fierce, unyielding tenderness. "The blizzard is over, my love. We will build the fire again." He held her there in the freezing, shattered ruins of the dugout, the profound, heavy silence of the Badlands settling warmly over them. The staggering fortune of gold lay forgotten in the dirt, but as the scarred mountain man knelt before the magnificent, deeply nurturing woman who had chosen his brutal reality over a gilded cage, he knew he possessed a wealth that could never be frozen, measured, or stolen. 5 years later, the dark, claustrophobic subterranean sod dugout was a breathtaking, impossible oasis of life on the edge of the Badlands. The underground bunker had been magnificently expanded outward and upward into a sprawling, sun-drenched, heavy timber frame homestead and clinic. A massive, perfectly functioning stone hearth radiated a constant, deep warmth through the wide rooms. The metallic smell of gunpowder and isolation had been permanently eradicated, replaced by the warm, sweet, intoxicating aroma of roasting elk, blooming indoor prairie flowers, and the rich, complex depth of brewing apothecary herbs. Clara was no longer the outcast of the territory. She was its most revered, legendary healer, sought out by passing wagon trains and isolated trappers alike for her miraculous hands. Sitting in a massive, heavy rocking chair carved from solid pine near the roaring fire was Thaddeus. He wore a clean flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his thick, scarred forearms. The cold, dead, feral terror in his icy blue eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep peace. Resting effortlessly against his massive, broad chest, entirely swaddled in soft, perfectly tanned rabbit furs, was a robust, giggling 4-month-old infant. The child was an orphan, the lone survivor of a tragic wagon accident on the nearby trail just months prior. The heavy, polished oak door of the clinic room creaked open. Clara stepped out into the warm, fire-lit living space. She wore a beautifully tailored, vibrant red dress of soft, breathable wool. She was entirely radiant, her dark eyes sparkling with profound, overflowing joy. The fragile, exhausted, humiliated woman weeping on the deadwood post was a distant, unrecognizable memory. She moved with total, unshakable confidence, owning her power and her sanctuary with the absolute, undeniable grace of a matriarch. She walked over to the rocking chair, resting her soft hand lightly on Thaddeus's broad shoulder, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to his scarred cheek. She looked down at the healthy, smiling infant nestled in her husband's colossal arms, her maternal heart overflowing with a fierce, absolute love that transcended all biology. Thaddeus smiled, a deep, rich expression that completely transformed his heavily scarred face. He didn't just look at his wife, he worshipped her. He reached his massive hand up, covering her fingers on his shoulder. His icy blue eyes met hers, filled with an adoration that was legendary across the entire territory. The cruel, fanatical society festering in the starving settlements far beyond the snowdrifts could keep their rigid ledgers and their empty judgments. Here, insulated against the howling badland winds, the scarred Leviathan and the master herbalist had proven with absolute, undeniable certainty that the most magnificent, enduring life is not born from a bloodline, but forged in the unyielding fire of a chosen, fiercely nurtured love.